I suppose it is only fair to start this video with a clarification. The very existence of this video is proof, or at the very least an acknowledgement, that not all is fine and rosy with EU5. After all, games that have universal or near-universal adoration, or frankly even games that are considered good overall, don't have videos in their defense, as it were. To the best of my knowledge, there aren't exactly people out there making videos like Portal 2 is a good game, actually. That all being said, I have heard before that while a player can absolutely tell you that they're not enjoying an aspect of the game, or even a game as a whole, they're usually very bad at saying why or even suggesting viable solutions. And so far, the feedback around EU5 I've seen has very much reinforced this claim. So with that said, my goal today is to address a lot of the criticisms I've seen, rephrase them into something more robust and frankly more actionable, but also at the same time my message that EU5 is good actually, always was, and not good in 3 years or good after 40 DLC or whatever. No, good now. Well, this is the video where I'll be defending that point. Nevertheless, I do still believe that the criticism, even if levied, dare I say, incorrectly, still comes from a place of people not enjoying the game, or not enjoying it as much as other games. And at the risk of spoiling my own video, but nevertheless for the sake of being upfront about it, well, the issue at the core I believe to be an issue of pacing, or game tempo, whatever you wish to call it. And it's an issue made substantially worse by the siege system, which is really bad, performance, which could be worse, but let's also be completely honest here as well, could certainly be better, and through the game UI, which simultaneously is greatly inadequate and fails to communicate critical concepts to the player, while also at the same time being, if not the best, one of the best Paradox UIs already in existence. Despite all of this though, I still believe EU5 to be a good game. That is the core of my argument, and the rest of this video will be a clarification with examples of what I mean here. That being said, before we begin, just the quick usual stuff to get out of the way. A like would be appreciated and a subscription would be amazing. The 100k sub goal is so close, yet so far, but nevertheless, I do hope we get there. Anyway, enough self-shilling, let's get into the video proper. The first category of complaints are somewhat the easiest to address, but some version of them is the one most usually floated around: the criticism of super-specific mechanics or implementations. These complaints, if they're not fundamentally false, which some of them are not actually implicitly bad, but the issue I have with them is the implication of the game as a whole, that is to say EU5 is bad because of a certain system or implementation. All of these words sound very vague, so let me hopefully clear it up with some examples. The Great Power system, to put it mildly, can be improved. There are some consequences of the 1.2 and earlier implementation of the Great Power system that are really rather stupid. To give but one example, if you're playing as France and you are Great Power number 2, because, well, China exists in their Great Power number 1, your cost of court is modified by 7.5% because you're Great Power number 2. So far, so good. However, if China goes into a substantial enough civil war or it collapses, what will happen is you will jump up to first in Great Power rank, and your cost of court will hence go to 10% instead of 7.5%. And on the scale of a country like France, that can genuinely represent an overnight increase in costs measurable in the hundreds of ducats. That is on its own already a bad system. The player is punished because of a factor entirely outside of its control. What do I, as the leader of France in say 1380, have that I can do as any possible way of impacting China? We are forced to confront the reality that according to the mechanics of EU5, a civil war in China has a noticeable impact on the French government spending. This is stupid, and it's fine to point out to this and go, this has a place for improvement. But it's also important to say this doesn't implicitly and immediately make the game as a whole bad. Games can be fun, but also contain stupid systems, implementations, and features, and remain fun despite that. Frankly, that's not a bad summary of Paradox games as a whole. To give but one really pointed counterexample, Hearts of Iron 4 is a very, very successful game. It is also a game where, until Gotterdammeruna DLC released, 8 months ago, the UK AI would just not defend mainland Britain. Like, they would just practically let you walk in. The meta became land in York, they have no troops there. The AI of the Gotterdammerun DLC now defends Britain, like, a lot more, which is to say they at least somewhat try. But Hoi4 is going to be having its 10th year anniversary soon, which is to say that Hoi4 spent around 9 years being a critically acclaimed game, while the leader of one of the two main factions would rather famously not bother defending themselves. The truth is, there are issues with EU5 which leads to players playing the game and not enjoying it. They then turn around and go, why am I not having fun? I should be having the fun right now, and they go seek answers. And let's be clear, EU5 has plenty of possible scapegoats, like the aforementioned Great Power system, which is getting reworked in 1.3. The thing is, what the scapegoats are changes very frequently and sometimes in ways which is rather humorous to observe from the outside. Let's continue on with the Great Power system example. In the announcement of the 1.3 beta, there was some outcry from the players within the Tinto forums of, why did you rework this? Literally no one was asking about this. Why did you change this at all? You have other bigger problems. Now, among the people complaining, there was an individual I'm going to refer to as Individual X. I'm doing this because you should not harass or contact this individual. I'm not joking, don't do it. If you find out who this individual X actually is, or knows already who this is from this conversation, keep that information to yourself. Clear? Wonderful. Anyway, this individual would leave a comment to the extent of, why did you rework Great Powers? No one wanted this change. But checking his forum history, he made 3 separate posts, genuinely countless comments as well, 2 to 3 months ago complaining about the Great Power system. In the most poetic way possible, Paradox quite literally listened to his complaint and reworked the system he was complaining about, but he had at that point moved on to a new scapegoat of why no fun in video game, I want the fun, and hence ended up complaining that Paradox listened to his advice. Yes, we're at the point where the EU5 players are complaining that Paradox is listening to them. The truth is, I know how fun in a video game is actually valid feedback. This system bad is also valid feedback, but fix this system and I have fun now is not a reasonable assumption to make from this. And the same can be said for any other system. No, the art mechanic being functionally useless does not make EU5 bad. And no, POPs practically only ever migrating between markets, okay, is frustrating and frankly stupid, sure, but also again does not make EU5 a bad game on its own. Where I find that these types of complaints reach their absolute peak status of irony nevertheless, is where the complaints are just wrong, like objectively wrong, and to give but one example of one of these objectively wrong complaints, I saw a comment on YouTube, not on my channel, but on a different YouTube channel, that said that EU5 is a bad game because in EU4 you have to make the choice between having a lot of crown land and giving out a bunch of privileges to the estates. But there is no trade-off like that in EU5. This is of course funny because the very literal opposite of this is true. In EU4 you can give your estates literally every single privilege, and then Devon sees land your way to 100% crown land, meaning that actually there is no trade-off there. You can just have max crown land and super powerful estates that love you. But in EU5, every estate privilege increases the power of the estates. And the estates, because they exist, hold inherent power. So even if you revoke literally every privilege and go full absolutism, then you would get what, 75%, maybe 80% crown power by the endgame? Like the equivalent of 100% crown land of EU4, 100% crown power in EU5 is just not possible with even all the privileges revoked. But while I also wouldn't say that 100% crown land with max privileges in EU4 is necessarily meta, well, it's not even a bad strategy, and also it's not an unpopular strategy as well. All of this is to say that, taken at face value, his confident criticism of EU5 applies more to EU4 than it does to EU5. Still, what must be said here is that again, a player can absolutely tell you they're not enjoying the aspect of a game, which in this case I presume to be they're not enjoying the estate system, or even the game as a whole, but they are very bad at telling you why. So what is the core reason in my opinion as to why EU5 bad, or at least why a lot of players are struggling to find the fun as it were in the game? I believe, as mentioned before, the core reason does come down to pacing, namely the speed at which things happen. This is not to be confused with AI aggressiveness or even timescale of the game itself. What I mean to say is fundamentally EU5 is just a very slow game, and while things will happen over the course of an entire campaign, if you actually sit down and play, say, an hour of EU5, you can genuinely end up spending most of that time just sitting there, watching and waiting and actually doing very little. Let me give you, I think, an example more so on the side of the extreme, but still an example that is very possible because it happened to me. It's a personal campaign of EU5 I played. I played as Florence and united Italy by, well, starting as Florence, forming Tuscany, and then forming Italy. All things considered, that is about as straightforward of a campaign as you can get in this game. And while it is true that I played it rather leisurely, I wasn't really in a rush or anything, well, my long-term goal for the campaign was tall scaling in Italy, which meant I wanted to take over Italy itself as fast as possible so that I could start playing tall within its borders. The conquest and coring part of the campaign I had managed to finish by around 1501, 1502, something similar. I no longer have the save to check, all I remember is forming Italy a bit before the 1500 year tick, but finished conquering the last province in the Italy region a couple years after the 1500s, and being frankly annoyed that I didn't manage to get it done before the start of the 16th century. Now that campaign I did conclude after I finished conquering Italy because I wanted to play other nations, but also had a coalition of all of Europe which I could beat, but I had already beaten them 4 times, and I knew they would deck a 5th time, and I couldn't be bothered to fight them again, just to get a very painful stalemate, so, well, I just scored the campaign there. The thing is, I also kept tabs on my playtime, and that campaign took me a comfortable just over 150 hours of real life time. I didn't keep too close tabs, to be clear. In fact, let's round up to 165 hours for the sake of my mental math, because by ending the campaign in 1501, I ended up playing 165 years, in 165 real-life hours, which is to say each year of in-game time took me an hour in real life. Now, I could have certainly played the Italy game a lot faster. It was also a campaign I microed really heavily, because I did a lot of fighting against frankly stronger opponents, and if I was playing someone like France a bit more casually, Well, actually, we know exactly what would have happened as well, because I did a meme run as France for my EU5 early access gameplay video. I had around 2 weeks to play and edit that campaign before the video had to go live, and ended up with 40 hours of raw footage, give or take, for a campaign that ended in 1500s. And I'll be honest, I certainly didn't record everything I did. Let's also be just generous and say I played for 60 hours, so I recorded 66% of all gameplay. I don't think this number is correct, but still, that comes out to 3 years in game for each hour. And that's a plain Tour France campaign. Like, I'm not exactly doing a lot of heavy micro campaigning here either. EU5 has improved since then, but the truth is, when it comes to the rate of things happening per hour, the rate within EU5 is just so much slower than practically every other Paradox game. Part of it is due to certain game design decisions, by all intents and purposes, nerfing the ability to fabricate claims and practically forcing you to rely on either no CPs, which are painful and expensive in stamp cost, or Parliament CPs, which you get one, maybe two if you're lucky every 5 years. Well, that is a very hard limit on the rate of things happening in the early game, and the early game is where you're going to have a lot of people playing said game. But this is then happening on top of the other reality. The reality that EU5 is still at its core a successor to EU4, meaning a lot of the timings end up being, if not similar, just straight up copy pasted across games. You call in a state parliament every 5 years in EU4 and EU5. Truces for a white peace are 5 years and 15 years for a 100 war score in both games. You still need to wait 10 years before you can start annexing a vassal, and so on and so forth. The real issue is, when you look at it in terms of real time spent, well, there's just a lot more waiting around in EU5 than in EU4. And frankly, there is more waiting around in EU5 than basically every other Paradox game I've ever played. And to me, because you are sitting there and you are getting bored, you start looking for and finding those issues that we keep mentioning. The core problem, however, is that I'm not having fun is certainly applying here, which I think is because you've just spent, what, an hour on max speed for 5 in-game years to pass to get a CB from Parliament, and you did not much else otherwise while waiting for that to happen. However, you're also a Paradox player. You probably have a couple thousand hours across these games, or at least are aware of their reputation if that is not the case. So I don't think that the pacing issue is what is at the forefront of your mind. You assume that this rate of pace to be normal, so you start thinking, oh, we need a DLC for 15 billion more events to happen, so I actually have my normal rate of flavor for things to happen. Well, let's be clear here, if you compare the density of things happening in EU4 to EU5 in terms of in-game years, I'd actually say that EU5 is already ahead of EU4 in terms of this department. However, EU5 is fundamentally behind because to play the same amount of time, you need to be spending just so much longer in the actual game. To really distill the issue down, a 5-year truce in EU4 is less painful in terms of waiting time than a 5-year truce in EU5, because the EU5 5-year truce takes a longer time in real life time to wait out. That is, I believe, to be the core issue. Game do be just slow. However, there are a couple things, namely hour ticks and hence combat around hour ticks, as well as the siege system as a whole, that make the core issues much worse in my opinion. There is also the case that performance, being less than stellar, again makes the core issue worse, and then the slow game pace makes other issues like game running bugs or UI frustrations that contribute to lost time or wasted time that much more frustrating. So let's get to all of that now, and we shall start with the siege system. The siege system is bad. I made a whole video essay about sieges in Paradox games, a link to that will be available in the top right here for you to enjoy, but beyond that though, to avoid repeating myself, well, the EU4 system is a bad system. The problem is, EU5 made it worse because they didn't change it. Which is an interesting statement, I'm sure you will agree. How do you manage to make something worse by copy-pasting it? Well, sieges were never fun in EU4, I'm sorry, because among many other problems, there wasn't too much you could actually do to impact a siege. Before it starts, yes, you can choose to bring more cannons, which helps sieging, sure, but once the siege is actually started, all you could do was breach walls, you could try and assault, and honestly that was about it, unless you count waiting harder. Otherwise, a siege, or more specifically a siege stack, was that thing you had to do, and that thing you had to babysit and wait for it to finish doing the thing, namely sieging, and once that was done, you could turn around and play the rest of the game. Well, EU5 has miraculously managed to make every single part of that worse. Incredible. Firstly, no mana means that a breach walls button is removed because it used to cost mill points, and if mill points don't exist, how do you balance a button like that? Like, I don't think they realized how, so they just got rid of it. This is a weird side effect and frankly not usually worth mentioning when you look at the game as a whole, but if you're trying to focus in on sieges, well, look, you have a system where as a player you have 3 options rounding up, and you're removing one of those 3 options, which is incredibly enough a 33% reduction in player agency. It gets worse when you realize, however, that yes, in both games, you don't start with cannon technology. You need Miltech 7 in EU4, barring the Ottomans of France, who start with early cannons from their missions to get siege equipment. But in EU5, you need to wait until the Renaissance spawns to get the first cannons after you research a bunch of technologies, which may be a roughly similar amount of time depending on tech speed and institution spread for both games. But remember, EU5 is a slower paced game, meaning you are waiting longer in real life hour terms before you get your hands on your first cannons as well. But okay, surely that's the end of it. No, but it continues to get worse somehow. Remember, EU5 is a slower paced game? Well, because sieges are practically unchanged, a 30-day siege tick in EU5 just takes longer to do than an EU4 30-day siege tick. Substantially so, and this gets worse because, of course, EU5 has added a lot more locations into the game, by adding, well, locations, a subdivision of provinces. This is an issue because it basically meant that the amount of forts present in a country and the amount of forts you need to siege to take a similar amount of land when compared to EU4 has basically increased the frequency of fort sieges I find anywhere from 3 to 5 throughout the course of the campaign. And the few good elements of EU4 siege warfare, namely the ability to create cool choke points, has also been hindered as that province count has gone up. This is all then placed on top of two decisions, which are not inherently bad decisions, but still, in my opinion, negatively affect gameplay, namely that provinces now have vegetation and terrain. The jungle mountain fort, for example, is something that used to just not exist, or the mountain forest fort. But it does mean that you can now stack a total dice roll modifier of -3, compared to the best possible terrain dice roll modifier in EU4 of being -2 from mountains. And I mention this because ramparts do exist in fairness, but those do take a while to unlock and AI rarely builds them. But they have no qualms about building mountain forest forts. This really favors the defender though, and there's nothing implicitly wrong about buffing defenders, but it does go against the aggressive playstyle which I prefer, and I think it also goes against the aggressive playstyle which I think most people prefer, hence I do mention it here. It is also somewhat of a side complaint, as we have to be honest, because with EU4, ramparts do eventually make again the -3 dice roll problem happen as well, but I think this is again mitigated somewhat by the fact that AI just doesn't really seem to bother building ramparts. Anyway, the other side negative change that I wish to mention is that you have this annoying winter mountain mechanic where you can't move into mountains in winter. This implicitly is a fine mechanic until you realize that this means that if you have a mountain fort, that someone moves onto it in, say, the summer. Well, the good news is they can't leave it in the winter. The bad news is, though, that they can still keep sieging it. And I find that the AI is great at rage baiting me by winning a siege in January or February, hence just before I can move in and relieve it. So yeah, if I were to address this frustration, one solution is to pause siege progress during harsh winters, which would suck as an attacker, but it would make me not avoid building mountain forts. But the other possibility would be to let you move through winter mountains if they're under your, say, core territory. Only apply the winter no mountain movement mechanic to invading forces. Or if you want to allow things like Hannibal's, allow the movement at the cost of substantial attrition. That all being said, look, the EU5 siege system could certainly be made worse, but it's truly based on the EU4 siege system, which does suck, and it does so in a way that really highlights the slower pacing of EU5, while also being a contributing factor to the slow pacing of EU5, because all of these issues I mentioned are avoided with pretty tedious micro that nevertheless forces you to spend longer on speed 3 with hour ticks as you wage your conquests and campaigns, and that is bad for the real-life hours to hours in-game conversion. Now, does the system implicitly make EU5 a bad game? No, because it is at its core the EU4 system, and EU4 is proof you can have a game with that bad system and be a good game. To claim that EU5 is bad because the siege system is bad would frankly make sieges seem far more important than they actually are, I do believe. But you know what is more systematically bad? The general game performance. Whereas sieges and warfare as a whole slow the game down by forcing you to spend a good chunk of it on lower speeds, the performance of the game attacks the other side, the bit where you need to wait a year or 2 or even 3 for a parliament, or to wait out a truce, or to start annexing a subject. It also affects the average run-of-the-mill campaign length, because bad performance also means that you're spending more real-life time per tick, and again, that starts to add up over the course of hundreds of years and dozens of campaigns. The thing is, it's important to mention though that when it comes to performance, it is never an easy feat. I promise you, no matter Paradox is choosing to make the game run slower. And their main performance-focused updates across all of their games, frankly, point to the fact that it's something they're certainly aware of. The issue, though, is that EU5 is a very ambitious game, and I don't want to use that term as a compliment. It just has a lot of locations, it has a lot of provinces and a lot of things going on. On top of this increased scope, we also just have a lot more things happening that require your CPU for your calculations. Live updating trade good prices are but one example. An example that used to happen in EU4, by the way, but was actually scratched because of, well, the performance issues specifically. Here is the thing. EU5 has made a lot of improvements in terms of its optimization, but it's used those improvements to greatly increase the scope of the game itself. It is a bit like watching someone earning $50,000 a year spend $30,000 a year paying for a sports car, and then when they get a huge promotion at work and go from making 50k a year to say 100k a year, they then turn around and finance a Lambo for 60k a year instead of just paying off their 30k a year car. The thing is though, this is not a problem unique to EU5. In fact, basically every single Paradox game continues to suffer with performance problems. It is somewhat of a problem that comes with the territory, as it were. What I think is a more important question to ask is why is bad performance more acceptable, or at least more acceptable in places like EU4 or Hoi4 or even in Crusader Kings 3? Well, to the surprise of I hope no one that is watching the video still at this point, it comes down to a case of things happening density. If there is enough going on to keep you entertained, but the game has taken a while to process month ticks, that's not implicitly a bad thing, right? Like, hour ticks in Hoi4 do make Hoi4 progress a lot slower, but Hoi4 is built with that game progression speed in mind, and at the end of the day, if the game is laggy but still playable and still fun, well yes, it's a bad thing, it's a place for improvement, but it's not exactly game-breaking. Speaking of game-breaking bugs, though, this does set up the segue very nicely into the next few issues I wish to address. Those are both the bugs and the UI, or more generally than the UI, I wish to talk about the game's inability to communicate with the player. Let's start by stating the obvious, bugs are bad. Features not working as intended is bad. But, if your campaign is ruined because of a bug, well, if it's a Hoi4 campaign that's ruined, congratulations, you've wasted an afternoon. If you've had a bug with the Protestant Reformation in the 1550s on a campaign that took 200 years, hence 200 real-life hours to get to that 1550 point, you've just ruined the equivalent of a month of full-time work. It certainly does go without saying, I hope, that this is worse than losing an afternoon, and hence can lead to a perception of this game is a buggy mess, even if the actual numerical count of bugs is the same or even lower than the other titles. Now, compared to release, well, by 1.2, a lot, and I do mean a lot of the bugs have been cleaned up now, but there's still many bugs that do continue to persist, albeit thankfully, usually they're rather more on the minor side, because we used to have bugs like the Protestant Reformation doesn't work actually, and we now have bugs like artists in your country work for free until you research the sponsor the art technology, and only when you finish researching it do they start actually demanding a salary. Like, I hope you do see how the magnitude of those two bugs is a bit different in terms of ruining your campaign. The other factor when discussing bugs that must be mentioned though, is that as much as we meme about bugs becoming features, they really do. But not even intentionally, more so in the way that we learn to use those bugs and implement those bugs as tools for our campaigns and playthroughs. There are honestly countless examples from Paradox I can use, but one that I personally think is rather funny comes from Civilization 3. In Civilization 3 there is a mechanic called Defensive Bombard, where if you have a unit with a Defensive Bombard value and an enemy attacks into that unit, providing that unit is behind another unit, the Defensive Bombard unit can basically take cover behind the main defensive unit and perform a Defensive Bombard on the attacker. The strength of this bombard depends on the unit, and this kind of makes sense. An archer has a defensive bombard value of 1, while an artillery has a defensive bombard value of 12, and this represents the fact that being hit with an artillery shell in the face in Civ logic is approximately equivalent to being hit in the face by 12 arrows, give or take. Anyway, this isn't the bug. The bug is that for whatever reason, I have no idea how they managed to spaghetti code this in, but the strength of your defensive bombard is multiplied by the amount of players in the game. So if you're playing single player, as the name may suggest, the power of defensive bombard is multiplied by 1, so it does nothing. But if you're in an 8-player competitive Civ 3 4v4 game, defensive bombard is suddenly 8 times stronger, and with that one simple change, namely that this is now a multiplayer lobby, that Stone Age archer you got there is literally hitting the enemy units with 66% of the firepower of an Industrial Age artillery unit. The thing is, this bug is so old, it is at this point in university working on their master's degree, which is to say that multiplayer mods and scenarios are balanced and in fact are now reliant on that bug working the way it does. It even adds another level of interesting dynamics to the game, because defensive bombard favors the defender, and as it becomes weaker, it does implicitly make it easier for the attacker to attack, and hence break through it. Since most games of competitive Civ 3 multiplayer are, again, played as a 4v4 game, this means that in situations where you enter late game setups, it can even make sense to kill a weaker player on the enemy team to reduce the defensive bombard of a stronger player that is your real target. But also, if you're playing in a 4v4 setup and say the enemy gets a lucky kill on you really early, so you're down to a 4v3 pretty early on, and you decide that, okay, I'm going to do a counter-attack in desperation, we have a slightly easier time doing so because defensive bombard is multiplied by 7 now, not multiplied by 8. All of this is to say, it is almost a perfect and still rather funny example of a bug that is at this point integral to the Civ 3 multiplayer community. So much so that if Firaxis were to randomly return to Civ 3 and drop a patch which would fix this bug, this would genuinely be devastating for them. But how does that relate to EU5? Well, as games become older, the bugs inside of them turn into features, and even when they're accepted as bugs, they just become a property of the game in the purest form of the term. The problem is, newer games don't have this big luxury. A bug in EU5 is just a bug, This can again lead to some rather funny feedback. For example, there is, I don't even want to say it's a bug, but let's just say it's an unintended consequences of how the War of the Protestant League is coded in EU4. See, because you can separate peace members of the League, and because the war gives you a huge truce for the purpose of coalition management, a good strategy was waiting for the League War to kick off to basically annex all of Germany using it, as you could separate piece everyone out, and they were usually small enough to full annex in one war if you had picked up some province Warsaw cost multiplier modifiers. However, this is a bug, or at the very least, it's not an intended way of playing the game. So in EU5 they fixed this, because in EU5 you can white peace people out of the League War, but you can't demand anything, not even money, or offer them anything, so you can't also bribe them out of the peace deal as well. The issue is, I have now genuinely read a post about EU5 being a bad game because the developers made it not possible to annex all of Germany during the religious league wars. It was quite a scathing review, to be fully honest, but also it was a bug fixed. They patched an exploit. For what it's worth, I think the game is in a better place if there isn't a way for the player to abuse a historical scripted war to annex all of Germany. But it's EU5, hence the narrative becomes game bad because developers hate fun, they nerfed this thing. If I were to, however, defend this particular player, it actually to me feels like a bit of a reverse bug situation, in the sense that the player expected the bug to exist, and when the Paradox devs patched it, they basically did a reverse bug where they ruined his plans for the campaign, which hence involved him wasting, again, 200 hours of his life, or however long it took him to get to that point. And as ironic as it is to say, had the game communicated to them that, oh, by the way, we fixed a specific bug much more clearly, I don't think they would have complained. It's a bit hard to communicate specific bug fixes for every kind of plan that can conceivably exist in this setup, but let's just, for the sake of argument, chalk it up to a case of bad communication, and that takes us quite well into the topic of the UI as a whole. The EU5 UI, all things considered, as I mentioned before, is at least pretty decent. In fact, I would consider it a very good UI. However, there are cases where it does just outright lie to you, where it fails to communicate pretty critical concepts, like for example, by the way, this button is how you change parliament, and also the UI is a big fan of hiding important information in obscure random menus. The thing is, all of these things sound like I should say the UI is bad, however, all of these things apply in equal measure to all of the Paradox games. Actually, they tend to be even worse than all the other Paradox games. Let's again start with the EU4, shall we? Let's start with the game lying to you, the projected income from sending your boats out to protect trade. To say that this number has any semblance on reality would be to give it an undeserved compliment. The number is a pure fabrication, but a fabrication which the game claims in full faith. Let's move on to failing to communicate critical concepts though, shall we? Well, managing your aggressive expansion so you don't end up getting coalition from expanding too quickly is a pretty key aspect of playing EU4, and the game fails to mention, for example, you need to have a negative opinion overall to join a coalition. It fails to mention that having a truce prevents you from joining a coalition. The game fails to mention that aggressive expansion ticks down at -2 a year modified by your improved relations for some reason, meaning that if you sign a peace deal on the 31st of December, you will get a -2 for free immediately, as just one example in this case. It also fails to mention that you need 4 people minimum in a coalition regardless of the size of the coalition to fire, and in fact all the information it does give you is a literal menu of these people would join a coalition, which fails to account for upcoming truces from the peace deal, and also frequently claims countries that were just straight up going to be annexed in said peace deal would nevertheless theoretically be able to join a coalition had they continued to be alive. And this is for the coalition mechanic, a pretty central mechanic in EU4. Next up though, we have hiding important information in menus, and where do we even begin? Let's start with a simple question. What does military tactics actually do? No, not like it makes you take less damage, or it's a good modifier that increases your strength in battles. Like numerically, what is the difference between having 1 mil tactics and 2 mil tactics? How does it compare to having plus 10% discipline? How does it compare to having 100% discipline? Or even, how do all of this interact with, say, the unipip system? Shock pips are the melee weapon damage pips, and fire pips are the range weapon damage pips. But longbowmen here have shock pips and no fire pips. Does that mean EU4 longbowmen fight by running up to their enemy and smacking them really hard with their longbows before sitting out the fire phase? Well, actually, according to EU4, that's exactly how longbowmen fight. What about general pips, though? We know they interact with terrain modifiers and the combat dice roll, but how does all of this interact with the battles and damage dealt and damage received, like, overall? And we're just talking about the combat system. How about dev cost? Like, how does dev cost work? Is development cost the same as development cost modifier? The answer is no, by the way. Development cost modifier and development cost are two entirely different things, and I still to this day get people confusing the two in my comment sections and all the EU4 videos on the topic. But to be clear, development efficiency, that is the same as development cost modifier, but not the same as development cost. Well, you only get development efficiency from technologies and nowhere else, but it is also just dev cost modifier, like it's the same modifier in that regard. But okay, moving on, gold mines can deplete. What's the math behind that? Alright, of course, the game communicates that math to you by saying, gold mines can deplete sometimes, hee hee. Thank you, Paradox, very cool. Trade is famously as a whole just an incredibly obscure mechanic that you basically just have to sit down and learn, and I'm honestly just sat here thinking, what part of EU4 is communicated well? Like, what actual mechanic, what concept of EU4 is communicated well to the player? The thing is, EU4 is a game that was hated by EU3 players on release, but it then grew an audience, slowly in a way where as new people joined the EU4 player base, they were always outnumbered by veterans who would go and say, of course a projected trade income from protecting trade is pure fabrication. How do you not know this? Are you stupid? And instead of blaming the game, the player was blamed instead. As the game grew, this core of veterans grew as well, and the general knowledge of game mechanics was hence expanded despite the best efforts of the UI. The issue is, with the release of EU5, suddenly all of these veterans are now learning the new UI innovations together. And now it's not a case of, obviously this UI element lies to you, you are stupid for not suddenly knowing all of the UI specialties. It's now presented as a case of, this UI is actually bad. I think it is important to mention again though here that I think the UI being better and communicating more of these concepts to the player is a good idea. Nevertheless, it is more so, again, ironically enough, an issue of pacing. If the game happened fast, there was more things to do, and in a really stupid way to phrase it, I'm sorry, but more fun per hour, I would believe it would serve as a better motivator to learn the UI. But I don't think that the UI is in any way actually bad. If anything, I think the EU5 UI is probably one of the best, if not overall best UIs Paradox has ever made, as ironic as it is to say. And so on that note, the question must then become, so why EU5 good? Because for a video that is meant to be defending this game, I've certainly done a lot of complaining. That being said, where I think EU5 shines is the nation building. Without a doubt, all of your buildings, the possible ways to scale your economy, all of the management with setting up trade routes, choosing where and how to urbanize, increasing your control, using everything from bailiffs to roads and bridges to do said increases of control, researching new technologies, unlocking new production methods, unlocking new buildings to build, building up things like dockyards and your harbor capacity to project your power overseas with maritime presence. I do believe that EU5 is a major fundamental improvement as a nation-building game. It is also a good game as a society estate management game, dealing with your estates, your internal politics, and all those external politics and implications is another area where I think the game does very well. And to solidify its lead over Victoria 3 personally, well, I do think that the combat system, even with the siege system being bad, is, well, still good overall. It is just an improvement of the EU4 combat system, and I like the EU4 combat system. I do believe if you approach EU5 with the understanding that it is a slower game, and frankly the expectation that it is a slower game, well, there is a lot of EU5 that can be loved. I would recommend, if you are playing EU5 yourself nevertheless, to take the time to look at what settings you can change to increase your performance. And I would strongly recommend running a UI mod. Personally, I've been using Glorp UI, and game version 1.3 will allow for achievements moving forward, so you can tailor your experience to however much you desire with mods. Which is to say, I'd really recommend you pick up a mod which removes hour ticks. There's a couple out there, and there's already debate about which is the best mod that removes hour ticks, which is an incredible debate to even exist. Now, they don't solve every single issue, but I do believe they make the game significantly faster, and in my opinion, hence significantly more enjoyable as well. Finally, and this is something that Paradox can take action on, but I certainly believe it is also moddable, albeit with a lot of work, well, I'm going to bring up an earlier point I made, that EU5 has done a lot of performance improvements, but then it turned around and gave us a map with 100 more billion locations. It is cool that Wales has 28 provinces, sure, but if you're playing a campaign in Japan, do we need to be calculating that? I mean, how many campaigns like ever do you actually end up touching Australia or interacting with Australia in any way at all? Because the honest answer is letting players disable regions is something Ambina already does, and honestly, as far as free performance improvement goes, doing that is just kind of a free win. Let those that want the full map pay the performance price, but by making it a choice, the performance hit becomes just more acceptable, I feel. And as for the impact on the wider world, well, yes, removing the New World will hurt colonizers like the Europeans, for example, and there's going to be plenty of examples like that, but if you just don't bother balancing it, as stupid as it sounds, well, have it as an optional difficulty setting. If you want to weaken the Europeans and you're playing as someone like Egypt, removing the New World is a way of improving your performance, and also it's just a way of nerfing the Europeans as, again, an optional difficulty setting. And in terms of making the game function with those regions removed, yes, this will be an issue if Europeans start demanding potatoes and you start demanding potatoes that don't exist, but you can just fix this by saying, okay, if there is a region-tied trade good, such as potatoes, or lacquerware, for example, if we're talking about China, just remove pop demand if you remove that region as well. You can do that with some relatively simple code. Pop demand for trade goods is already conditional upon certain years or certain discoveries being met. Just add a condition where if region is removed, remove the pop demand as well. And I think with that being said, it should be just a pretty playable game with minimal losses in terms of the gameplay options and developments from that. and maximum customization for the players, especially for those that are, for example, if you're just looking for a India campaign and you just want to unite India and you don't care about what happens in the rest of the world, well, you can do that, and there's no need for you to go simulate the European wars of religion. Furthermore, and this is going to sound even more ironic, if you're doing the same India campaign and you want to do a defend India from European colonization, by removing, say, Africa and the New World, you're probably going to make the Europeans focus on colonizing India more targetedly, which is to say you'd actually have, again, more of a challenge from this if that is something that you seek. It is here, by the way, I must confess that the suggestion to remove regions, well, that is not my idea. I didn't even steal it from Ambana. I actually got an email of all things about the suggestion, which I'm going to be showing on screen now. Do feel free to give it a read. I mean, actually, I would encourage you to give it a read. I think it outlines a lot of very excellent points that are very well made. If it is not readable on screen for you, I do apologize, but you will find the email in text form as well as a downloadable TXT posted on my Discord if that is something you'd prefer. Speaking of my Discord, if you do wish to suggest things to me or speak to me, please do so there. I do spend a lot of my time on Discord to the detriment of my upload schedule, to be frank. And while you can reach me by email, well, look, I check my email once a month if it's a lucky month. The purpose of my contact email address, after all, was for sponsors to contact me if they want to give me free money. I mean, sponsor a video. And sometimes that does happen. Rarely, sure, but it can happen. However, it does seem that a contact email does mainly exist to get scams and spam. Oh, and also AI girlfriend sponsors. That's a lot of AI girlfriend sponsors. Like, I don't think I can communicate just how many AI girlfriend sponsors are trying to get me to promote their AI girlfriend services, with features like, get her to do everything you say, and staff don't read chats. Right. How do I say this? Putting all of the morality, mental health, self-respect questions aside, and I know that's a lot to put aside, but bear with me. We are all on the same page, right? In the sense that Stable Diffusion is an open source model. That's the base model all of these companies are using to generate those AI girlfriend services for you, I promise. I also do hope we know that training the model is the computationally intensive part. Actually generating your spicy girlfriend Stable Diffusion pictures is computationally pretty trivial, all things considered, once the model is trained. And it's not like you need to be a coding genius to set it up either. The Stable Diffusion GitHub basically gives you a full walkthrough, and in fact, it's so tutorialized that, well, look, the thing is written in Python, or at least using a lot of Python code. So Stable Diffusion used to say that you need Python installed on your computer to be able to run the program. However, they've reduced the barrier to entry even more so that at this point you can actually download a I have no Python on my computer version and just run it with a click, like run it as a normal program, like you'd run any other app. And yes, I understand this is for image generation, but look, there's plenty of open sourced AI chatbots you can locally host to exist. And I don't want to be that guy, but if you have an AI girlfriend who's also speaking to presumably many other users of this service, that doesn't sound like a girlfriend, or at least that sounds like a very open relationship, honestly. So I'm just going to say this, you can't really claim it's your AI girlfriend unless you're local hosting the model. Sorry you have to hear it from a pastry on the internet. Well, hopefully this scathing review of the AI girlfriend business model stops them spamming my inbox, but I doubt it somehow. I think they just see my 99% male audience, with 80% of them being in the 18 to 24 age bracket, and decide I am a perfect fit. And, well, I will be ashamed to admit they're probably more right than they're wrong. That absolutely huge tangent aside, sorry, I wanted to vent, my final closing thought I wish to address is two more narratives. Firstly, around missions and around the continued EU4 player base. Missions as a topic deserve their own video, I'm sorry, but as a quick adage here, missions are just a possible method of delivering content. That's it. If you were to take the content in EU5 and arrange it into missions, I doubt this would fix, well, much of anything, really. However, the narrative that you need missions or game dead, or more insidiously, I believe, you need missions or all countries feel the same, is a really stupid, unhelpful narrative, because, God, someone tell the CK3 and CK2 enjoys that they can't be enjoying their game, they don't have missions. Speaking of games with missions, though, how's Imperator Rome doing? I heard it has missions. In fact, I frequently get comments praising the Imperator Rome mission tree, or even praising Imperator Rome as a game, saying it was murdered. But yeah, despite Paradox's unironic best efforts, you guys hated the game. Did you just forget that? Did you forget the part where Imperator Rome's development was paused and stopped, and then as soon as that happened, a bunch of people went, "No, you can't do that. We love this game, actually," forgetting the fact that like a week ago they were complaining about how bad the game is? It's kind of hilarious, but stopping the development of Imperator Rome made people review it positively. It's kind of insane. Now, they aren't playing the game, of course, so let's be clear about that, but they do vocally talk about how good the game is, like, all the time. I feel like a very similar thing happened with CK2. People were hating on CK2 constantly until CK3 released. And when CK3 released, people went back to CK2 and said it was the perfect game. And I think the same is currently happening for Hoi4. Hoi4 is pretty regularly getting hated for every single DLC release, it feels, but I think the moment that Hoi5 is announced and they release Hoi5, people will look back at Hoi4 as the perfect game. That complaint aside, I do think people just love to complain, but yeah, missions are not a silver bullet. Imperator Rome was criticized for lack of content and uniqueness while having missions. It died. Crusader Kings 2 and 3 didn't have missions. Those games are loved. But regarding the EU4 player base though, and its continued existence, while there is some conversation around what can be done to quote-unquote move the EU4 players over to EU5, or from the other angle, there is a case that the continued existence of the EU4 community is somehow proving that EU5 is a bad game, because a lot of people are still playing and still presumably enjoying EU4. I think there are some kernels of truth to this statement, but I want to bring up a very unexpected counterexample: the Civilization series. Now, the franchise is currently facing some issues with Civilization 7, meaning that the average Civ player is playing the most modern good Civilization game, aka Civ 6. In fact, let's be clear here as well, Civilization 6 was a pretty positively received game. Of course there were people complaining, there always are, but look, when comparing concurrent players in Civilization 5 versus Civilization 6, on release there is naturally an expected big spike in concurrent players. However, it is very quickly overtaken back by Civ 5, at a time when Civ 6 is a critically acclaimed game. With the release of a DLC, we do see again another shoot-up, and Civ 6 again takes over Civ 5 for concurrency, but it takes until the second DLC comes out for Civ 6 before Civ 6 firmly overtakes and continues to, well, basically entirely overtake Civilization 5 as a newer, better game when we look at their concurrency numbers. And again, Civilization 6 at this point is pretty continuously sitting as a very positively reviewed game. But anyway, today, a lot of people are playing the current newest, best Civilization game. They're playing Civilization 6. There is, on top of this crowd of players, a crowd of back in my day enjoyers of Civilization that argue that the best Civ game isn't Civ 6, they argue that the Civilization franchise actually peaked at apparently Civilization 4. This is a debate all unto itself, what was the best peak of Civilization, but for our purposes, it does mean there is a group of people who belong to that old guard camp, and those people are playing Civilization 4. However, outside of those two camps, we also have Civilization 3. I mentioned them earlier, and Civilization 3 is in a fascinating position, because the old guard, old grumble people back in my day enjoyers, well, they are playing Civ 4. And the people that play the newest game are basically split, mostly split towards Civ 6, but nevertheless split between Civ 6 and Civ 7, with notable holdouts in Civilization 5. So who's playing Civilization 3? You would think not many people, and you wouldn't be wrong on the scale of a Civ game, but this is in fact a game released in 2001. It is over 25 years old at this point, and according to SteamDB, this game has comfortably hit over 1,000 concurrent players, with daily peaks exceeding 1.5k players. In fact, if you were to consult the graph as it were, well, you can see there's no initial release spike, because again, this is a 2001 release, Steam wasn't a thing back then, and I'm sure a lot of people still play it from disk, but that graph and player base looks pretty healthy to me. Why? Because even according to the herder back in my day people, that back in my day best Civ game is Civ 4. Why are people playing the quote-unquote objectively worse Civ 3? The current newest best game is Civ 6. Why does Civ 3 retain this audience? Well, it's a really simple reason. Civ 3 is a good game. It's a fun game. And that means that people learn to play it and enjoyed playing it and will return to play it when nostalgia hits. But also, it is in many ways a comfort game. A game you've played for 20 years after all may get stale, sure, but it's also a game you're probably going to feel comfortable in. You're very unlikely to get any surprises from the game at this point, and if you have an hour before bed, it's a pretty low-risk way of getting some fun out of that hour without having to worry about learning a new video game or anything of that nature. And all of those things I've just said apply to EU4 even more so. There is a significant portion of people out there that have 5k hours in EU4 but don't have the time to learn EU5, or don't have the will to learn EU5, or don't have a PC good enough for EU5. EU4 is still a good game and will remain to be a good game, and everything I've said about Civilization 3 will apply to EU4 for decades to come. Short of a global apocalypse or something, I don't expect the EU4 audience to dip much further than it has already since the release of EU5. And while of course I support updating EU5 and making it a better game, the existence and continuation of an EU4 community is no more proof that EU5 is a bad game than the existence of a Civ 5 community being proof that Civ 6 is a bad game. EU4 is a good game. Civ 3 is a good game. EU5 is a good game. Civ 6 is a good game. All of these statements can be true at the same time. But all of that together is my pitch for why EU5, a game with certainly many issues, is still at its core a good game. Not a good game in 3 years when they add more DLC or whatever. It is a good game for the mechanics that exist now, despite the issues. To finish this video off though, I want to go on one final tangent. See, I've mentioned Civilization 3 a lot in this video, and I've frequently done so on this channel as an old video game for the point of comparison or discussion. I don't believe it is any kind of secret at this point that I like Civilization 3, and it is a game I will occasionally open up for the odd random single-player campaign or a scenario playthrough, and I also tend to enjoy Civ 3 competitive multiplayer. As I mentioned before, yes, the competitive MP community still exists, and still regularly host games, which are usually in the 4v4 format. MP mods like Modern still get updates, and classical MP mods like QC, Future, and MPT definitely see play as well, even though I do believe MPT has had its last official update from the mod maker back in like 2003. What you have on screen right now is some gameplay footage from a good friend of mine, Suede, who also makes video essays on YouTube, but focuses more on the Civilization franchise, as well as playing a lot of Civ 3 in the process. Do feel free to check out his channel, but also, if competitive Civ 3 is something that even vaguely interests you, well, feel free to check it out. As mentioned before, it's hosted in a 4v4 format, so you'll most likely end up on a team with veterans that have played the game for literal multiple decades. A fact that can have its upsides, but certainly has its downsides as well, and I'm just letting you know ahead of time. It is also a game from 2001, so do be aware of that, so while Steam multiplayer does work, expect many a desync and issue around it. Paradox MPs I would say are more stable than Civ 3 MP, but honestly it's not by much of a margin. The good news is, though, is that it is a very old game that is very playable on basically any hardware, and Civilization 3 on Steam will set you back a very neat 85 pence at the moment, so honestly, it seems to be on sale more often than not. Like, I've tried to take a screenshot when it's not on sale and I failed to do so. It's not like you're risking a lot of money by looking around. I mean, 85 pence comes out to around half an hour of minimum wage work in Brazil, so even if you're working a minimum wage job in Brazil, I'd say you can probably actually afford this game, nevertheless. But yeah, if you haven't been convinced by my arguments for why EU5 good, but you still have some spare time to play video games, check out Civ 3. With that all being said, that is certainly all the time I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching all the way to the end. If you made it, mention, oh I don't know, strawberries. Say something about strawberries in the comments section. I want to hopefully confuse some people with that, or not. You can do what you want, but nevertheless, I will be ending the video here. Massive thank you to all my channel members, with a special thank you to Ark, Solas, Lemon, Lord Zendika, Nick Castan Hatan, Sal72, The Awesome Rabbit, Best for Gaming, Grandma Flavia, Lebrule, WH Sov, Anthony35, AC Napo, Conspiracy Pizza, Yukata, Danray, Marley, Jack, Ryland, Stuart Andrew Black, Nebula, Centronic, Twinit, Aquabird, Yakaman, Barak, Lord Swarfin, Tukvarin, and Klopkog.